I guess it started when I was probably in the 7th or 8th grade, mowing lawns for the school district in Sandpoint, Idaho. When I used to spend my lunch times in the libraries of the different schools, and I got interested in the books that were there about Roman and Egyptian things, and after that I went to the University of Idaho and discovered I had no talent at all to be an engineer, and so I decided I might as well do something I was interested in, and so I came to the University of Arizona as an undergraduate and basically got into the details here. Well, I started out majoring in anthropology, and at some point, actually when I was a senior, I took a course in tree ring dating from Bryant, Bannister, and became fascinated with that and continued on doing archaeological tree ring dating and that sort of thing for a graduate degree, and stayed on at the tree ring lab after that up to now. Well, it was something I'd never considered before I took that course from Bryant Bannister, and he had just finished doing his research on the tree ring dating of Chaco Canyon sites, so I got interested in that, and he was exploring the ways that tree ring dating could produce archaeological information in addition to just pure dating. And so I got interested in that, and then the opportunity came up to go up to Navajo National Monument and work on Batatacan and Keat Seal in excruciating detail, both in terms of the archaeological data, the architectural data, and lots of tree ring dates from both sites. And it was an exploration of what you can do with tree ring data, just beyond dating. And from that point, that was my dissertation, and from when I went up there, there were something like 14 tree ring dates from Batatacan and maybe 20 or so from Keat Seal, which really did not produce much more information than the vague time period. So what I was planning to do was, because the preservation was so good, was core every beam in the sites and get all possible tree ring dates out of them, and then integrate that with the architectural data on sequence of room construction and stuff like that to create a really refined, absolutely dated chronological record of or two particular sites. And one result was that it worked for both of them. But beyond that, it provided a heck of a lot of behavioral information that was what we were aiming for. One being that it showed that the household, as exemplified by a suite of domestic rooms, was the basic building block of the site, that there wasn't much organization above that except the village itself. You didn't have these intermediate levels of organization like you get, say, at Mesa Verde or Chaco. You had an aggregation of households by kiva ceremonies, and that was it. And that led, being able to date the coming and going of households. I mean, structurally they were independent, architecturally, but you could look at their coming and going through the tree ring dates, and they actually were behaving independently. They'd come and they'd leave, and somebody else would come in and occupy the rooms and things like that. And so we got a really good idea of the flexibility of the organization of these places. Well, after finishing Keat Seal and Batatacan, I realized that there were several other cliff dwellings in the same canyon, so the next project was to look at a number of these other sites in the same way to see if we got the same picture, which we did. And from that, went from that to a big project that Bryant Bannister developed to reanalyze all the archaeological tree ring samples we had in the tree ring lab, which was tens of thousands. And over a period of 6 years, I think, we did reanalyze everything we had, which combined our own material plus material from the Museum of Northern Arizona, from the Lab of Anthropology in Santa Fe, from Gila Pueblo and Globe, and from the Navajo land claim. And we ended up with increasing the number of dates in the collection by this reanalysis by 600%, and the number of dated sites by the 600% as well. So that was sponsored by NSF, and it created the basis for what we've done ever since in this tree ring dating program here in archaeology. We also created the system for controlling the samples, where they are, you know, where they're from, and all the data from these things. So, and then from there, Bill Robinson and I got interested in highly detailed climate reconstruction with tree rings. I mean, it was possible, people were doing it all over the world, but we wanted to get a resolution down to the southwest. So we ended up with 30 different dendroclimatic stations in the southwest, so we could look at change through time, annually, seasonally, up to whatever larger unit. And we also could look at spatial variability, and which we did. We went out and collected numerous living tree sites across the southwest that were then combined with archaeological material from nearby areas to produce 30 climate-sensitive chronologies that we then applied standard dendroclimatic analyses to. So we could reconstruct relative changes, we could reconstruct inches of rainfall and degrees of temperature and stuff like that. In doing that project, we realized that there was a heck of a lot more going on than just dry versus wet and that sort of thing. There were lots of other characteristics of southwestern climate that would have impacted the people that were living there, such as spatial variability and temporal variability, as the rapidity with which things change through time, and other aspects that people hadn't considered before, which again produced a lot of good information on how the prehistoric people of the region reacted to different kinds of variability in the environment. And so that was a direct outgrowth of the reanalysis project, because the reanalysis project measured representative series from every place, so we could combine those with the living tree sequences using quantitative data. So the climatic analysis was a direct outgrowth of the reorganization and expansion of the actual database, and that was an outcome of the previous work. So this whole series of things that developed one out of the next, sort of in an organic fashion. And from that, went into we got this regional perspective on all this stuff. And so one of the other things we wanted to do was look at it locally and get a specific picture of what was going on in some particular place. So Bill Robinson and I cooperated with Lex Lindsay on picking an area on the Navajo reservation where we could do that. So we picked Longhouse Valley, which is southwest of Kayenta, a few miles, 15 miles, and is a nicely contained area environmentally, so we could define the boundaries of it and things like that. And then we did over several years, did a 100% survey of the area. So we had absolute control of the archaeological resources in there, and then we're able to use the local tree ring chronology to look at how those people responded in really refined scales to the local variations in climate. Not just tree rings, but at the same time we began working with geologists from the USGS and Flagstaff to look at changes in the alluvial valleys up there, the sequence of deposition and erosion of sediments and the rise and fall of alluvial water tables and all that stuff that would have affected agriculture on a low frequency scale, because those things change over time, whereas tree rings we can look at change annually or seasonally. And then combining those, you get a good picture of what's people had to deal with back then. The interest in climate effect on humans in a small scale setting in Longhouse Valley led to a project with George Gummerman and people at the Brookings Institution who were working on theoretical models of social development under various conditions. And we provided the environmental data. You have to have a model of landscape changes that you can use as input for human response. And so combining the alluvial groundwater data, the low frequency data, with high frequency tree ring reconstructions, we created a production landscape that mimicked Longhouse Valley. The units we used were amount of corn available per hectare per year. And then there was an agent-based model, so we had households who made decisions based on what they thought would be a good place in that particular year. And we then ran that on an annual basis from 800 up to 1350, which was after the valley was actually abandoned. And then used the instructions that we had set up for how households would respond to various kinds of changes, to have these households, these artificial households, actually respond to what was going on, and then see how that matched to the actual record in Longhouse Valley. The Brookings guys had all these nice models, but they had no way to test them, and so this was one way they could do that. And we got contacted them through the Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe. And the interesting thing is that we run the model for those couple or 1,000 years or so, and it came out almost virtually exactly the same as the prehistoric human occupation of the area. The site distributions were the same at different times depending on the environmental conditions. One site, the biggest site in the valley, turned up in exactly the same place every time we ran it. And so we figured we had a pretty good handle on what was going on there. That came to an end because the Brookings guys got sidetracked into modeling bioterrorism, and they gave up archaeology because they were doing that for free. But anyway, that led to a lot of insights into what was going on in that area. A lot of our students are carrying on that same approach now to predict or post-dict what should have happened, and then compare it to what really did happen in various places across the Southwest. So it continues on. And the other prong of that, the dating, went on at the same time as all this other stuff. So it wasn't one succession after another, but they interacted with one another and so on. And so through, again, contact with George Gummerman, I got interested in the Navajo sites that were being investigated by the Black Mesa Archaeological Project in connection with the coal mines up there, which is just south of Longhouse Valley. And so Scott Russell and I, who is an ethnologist who works with Navajos a lot, spent a lot of time on the mesa sampling Navajo archaeological sites. And apart from the dating again, the purpose beyond that was learning how Navajo wood use behavior affected the process of getting information out of Navajo sites. Like, where do you look for context in Navajo sites that will give you the most accurate information on chronology and at really fine scales, so that we can then adapt sampling to, say, pick particular parts of hogans that tend to have more freshly cut logs in them than the rest of the hogan, and ignore the part that's not likely to do it, so we can really focus on relevant stuff. Different kinds of structures have different potential for dating, and different parts of different structures. And that also allows you to develop ways to sample Navajo sites for wood, because Navajo sites have thousands of wood samples in them, or wood elements in them, and you couldn't possibly do the whole thing like we do for Pueblos. And so this whole project, first off, was our interest was developing these models of Navajo wood use behavior, and then using them to sample sites and evaluate the dates. And then compare that to while we've been doing Pueblos for decades, which had produced a implicit model of Pueblo wood use that people had been using to interpret tree ring dates from Puebloan sites for a long time. And it's totally different from what Navajos do. So Navajo sites are different from Pueblo sites in structure and temporal information, and so you have to sample them differently. You can't just go around and try to apply the same techniques to one kind of site and the other. An example of that was that 1977 went to Chetrokettle and Chaco Canyon to core every log we could see in the site. And we got something like 270 samples from there. And this place has 500 rooms. And a little while later, we were on Black Mesa contemplating this Navajo hogan that probably had as many pieces of wood in it as all of Chetrokettle did. And that gives you some idea of the differences between the two kinds of things. And that's still ongoing as well. And from a different direction, Ron Towner, who was on the faculty here, got into doing Navajo Pueblitos in New Mexico, in the homeland of the Navajos. And so we can compare Pueblito structures, which look like Pueblos, to Navajo ones. So the variability within that particular pattern, as well as between them. Now, when I first got into archaeology, and at least as a student at the U of A, classification was the big deal. And in general, archaeologists would consider their job done pretty much when they assigned a site to a phase or a period or something like that. And that passed for explanation in archaeology at the time. You put it in the Tsegi phase and then you knew what it meant. And several of us as students were kind of uncomfortable with that, and we thought you could do more. And that's why I got into all this other stuff, was to find new ways of looking at archaeological sites and data and ask more anthropologically relative or relevant questions and see if we could answer them, like what were households doing in 1250 and stuff like that, and how did that differ to what households in Mesa Verde were doing at the same time, and that sort of thing. Because we have this nice, really neat temporal control that you can say Suite of Rooms in Mesa Verde was built in the same year as one in Keat Seal, and you don't often have that sort of thing. So I think I thought you really should take advantage of that and come up with explanations or hypotheses about past human behavior that integrated time and space and then behavior. I mean, my teachers that I had at the U of A, like Emil Howery and Ray Thompson and others, were really receptive to that sort of thing and encouraged me along the way, stuff like that. And the Park Service, when this whole Keat Seal Batatican thing was presented to them, they were really receptive to that, particular Eric Reed and Gordon Vivian. And they provided a little bit of money to do it. And the park itself put us up, or put me up for 3-4 summers and let me go out to these sites and live there and things like that. So they were extremely supportive, and of course Bannister was, in the tree ring lab. Then along the way, lots of colleagues. I mean, Ron Towner, who I've been working with for a long time on Navajo stuff and other stuff, both in Arizona and in Deneta in New Mexico, and other people, Lex Lindsay, Bill Robinson, those, where we did the Longhouse Valley project, and Rob Axtell and Josh Epstein at Brookings, and it helped to have people like that involved because they didn't know anything about archaeology, and they asked kinds of questions that archaeologists assumed they knew about, but often didn't. So it was a good way of expanding the scope of what we were doing. But at the same time, I got semi-active in the Santa Fe Institute with people who, again, were studying human behavior, but on level of modern society and that sort of thing. But they had developed all sorts of interesting hypotheses that we could look at, given the Longhouse Valley data and the programs and things. So that worked out all right. So there are countless numbers of people that have become involved in these, students, other faculty people, Park Service people, Forest Service people. That's the nice thing about the tree ring lab, is that it's a hugely interdisciplinary unit. We have in the lab, we have archaeologists, we have biologists, we have statisticians, we have ecological scientists, we have fire historians, we have all people that, anything you can do with tree rings, which is a lot, we have people here that do it. And so you get this tremendous amount of connection of ideas, so that they ask questions of us that we can help them with. And they give us ideas that we never would have thought of. And in the process, it's not just students, it's faculty and everybody else. It's a unique situation, which has inspired a lot of the research I've done. Students get sucked into that like I did, and a lot of them continue to apply this sort of interface between dendrochronology and archaeology or anthropology, either one. I couldn't name them all, but people like Rick Ahlstrom, who was one of our early students and did important work at the Hopi village of Walpi, trying to integrate these ideas about what you learn about society and from tree ring dates and information. Ron Towner does that kind of thing. Lately focusing on Anglo homesteads in New Mexico. He started out mainly doing Navajo stuff, but he got into homesteading and has come up with all sorts of good ideas about that. One thing that happens is you sort of branch off into these weird tangents that turn out to be fairly interesting. A number of years ago, well, this goes back to Bannister, working at Chaco Canyon in the sites there. And he found there the usual species that you find in southwestern sites, mainly ponderosa pine, juniper, some Douglas firs, some piñons, that sort of stuff, which is you find all over the place. But he also noticed a whole suite of logs that didn't fit into any of those categories. And so he called it species X. And a few years after that, Julio Betancourt, who was a student at the time, got interested in that program, and he and I worked on a way to identify the species using electron microscope scanning. And it turns out that species X is really based on these really microscopic criteria, was two different genera, spruce and fir. And so something like 20% of the timbers from Chaco Canyon were either spruce or fir. We can't tell them apart really without really getting too complicated. I mean, you have to have your own electron microscope. But, and from that, some of our students later on said, well, why not look at strontium isotope ratios to see if we can source these timbers that we know came from different places, because spruces and firs only grow in the mountains. And so we had a couple of graduate students in geosciences who went out and sampled the localities in the mountains around Chaco where these trees grew, and got signals of strontium ratios from them, and then looked at the logs from the ruins, and were able to show that the spruces and firs were being acquired by Chacoans from at least two different places. One was the Chusca Mountains, and the other was Mount Taylor area, and hauling these logs 50 miles across this desert landscape to get them from the mountains to Chaco. And then a few years after that, just recently, one of our graduate students named Chris Gitterman developed a technique for using the ring series themselves to source logs from Chacoan sites in the canyon, and confirmed that indeed they were getting these things from the Chusca Mountains in huge quantities. But before that, they were going all the way to the Zuni Mountains for timbers that they hauled from there. And then in sort of the early 1000s, they shifted from the southwestern or the southern area of Zuni to the Chuscas. And Zuni drops out and Chuscas come in. And so that's the kind of thing you can, I mean, these things develop. You don't plan to do those until some bright graduate student comes along and said, why can't you do this? And so, and we have this incredible resource for new analysis in the collections here, wood collections. We have 400,000 plus archaeological tree ring samples in storage from the Southwest. And so that's where these studies of electron microscopy, the strontium ratios, and the ring width sourcing all used the samples that we have here. If we didn't have those, it would be nothing. Couldn't do it. But that's kind of an example of the way this stuff snowballs, that one thing leads to another, and luckily enough we kept all that stuff, so we can actually look at that. Another example would be a visiting scholar here from University of Texas at Arlington who took really high-resolution photomicrographs of wood, and his interest was in identifying frost rings in trees from archaeological sites in the Southwest. And these frost rings are trees that are damaged because it froze during the growing season, and so the moisture inside the cells freezes and it ruptures the cell walls. And for one thing, he expanded the species. Nobody thought junipers had frost rings, but they're full of them. And so we expanded that. And from Mesa Verde, find different sites have a different pattern of frost rings, suggesting that they're getting, each site, each village was getting juniper logs from a different place. And this is, again, the kind of things that tree ring analysis can do for you that couldn't do any other way, and expands it hugely beyond just dating. Well, one thing I think is that a lot of archaeologists in the past and now are unaware of the potential of what dendrochronology can do for them. And so they're faced with time constraints and stuff like that, and money constraints, and they're satisfied with giving dates and don't go much beyond just dating a site, you know, date 1030s or something like that. Whereas you can look at these more detailed and anthropologically informative kinds of information that are in these pieces of wood or charcoal. And we spend a lot of time trying to spread the word, and we've done so. I mean, they find it really interesting, but we have the facilities to do it, so we generally do that sort of thing. But it would help if they had, a lot of people had just a better idea of what was going on and what could be done, what can be done, and they're developing new things all the time here and elsewhere. So in terms of the interface between dendroarchaeology and archaeology, it's porous, but there's also a lot of not resistance, but people don't resist it, they just don't deal with it. So it's not so much that they're against it, it's just they don't have time or whatever to deal with it. But I just think more awareness would help everybody, would help us, because we get more tree ring data that way, and they would get some information that they could use. Mm-hmm. We try to, when people send material in and we analyze it, we try to transmit that information along with the dates, but it often just gets shunted aside somehow. So probably partly our fault. We should probably make it more formal. But again, we don't have unlimited resources. Ron and I both, and Bill Robinson and other archaeologists that have worked here, Bannister, are committed, have been committed to doing things that are not just chronometric, but anthropologically relevant information comes out of it, so that we can use this to study aspects of human behavior, for example, that can't be approached with other kinds of data. You can't do that with radiocarbon dates. And we might say this, that throughout, ever since I got here, in whenever that was, 1957 or something, the lab has always been closely integrated with other departments on campus, including anthropology from the beginning. So we've served on as adjunct faculty for these different departments, which allows us to contact students and mentor students and get information across that we think is important relative to that interaction. So it's another aspect of the University of Arizona that's far exceeds most other universities, and that is interdisciplinary between, for example, all the sciences that do climate research or geology or that sort of things are do things with us and vice versa. The strontium research with Chaco wood, the students and part of the faculty involved were from geosciences. And in other cases, climatologists get involved and that sort of thing. So it's a really dynamic situation that has been since, like I say, 50 years or more. And of course, Douglas, who invented this whole thing, was an astronomer, and the faculty here represents a huge number of different disciplines over time. I don't know that it's a trend, but it's becoming more compartmentalized, I think, so that communication among individuals and institutions is more constricted than it used to be. We've had the advantage here in the archaeological program of interacting with everybody because they all want tree ring dates. So we interact with contract archaeologists just as much as we do with academic archaeologists, but that kind of interaction usually doesn't seem to me to be as frequent as it ought to be at other levels. And so we have a really good handle on what's going on in the Southwest because they send us material. And academic people are more focused on their own thing and aren't aware of what other people are doing, and so on. So I think that's an unfortunate development, but I don't know how I don't have any suggestions for fixing it other than send your stuff to a tree ring lab.